BME 27. HR director at manufacturing company with 250 employees across production, quality control, logistics, and administrative departments, had strong feminist beliefs about workplace equality, passionate about creating an environment where women felt empowered and protected from discrimination, posted frequently on social media about importance of vigilant HR oversight, ensuring men were held accountable for workplace behavior, believed that surveillance and monitoring were tools of patriarchal control that women didn't need, but that could catch male misconduct. Got promoted to HR director specifically because company wanted aggressive approach to preventing harassment and discrimination claims. One of my first priorities was implementing strict policies about workplace recording and surveillance to protect employee privacy. Posted about how workplace cameras and recording were patriarchal control mechanisms creating hostile surveillance environment. Drafted comprehensive policy prohibiting employees from recording conversations, meetings or interactions without explicit consent. Policy stated that unauthorized recording would result in immediate termination regardless of content or reason for recording. Presented policy to executive team emphasizing importance of protecting employees from surveillance, culture, and privacy violations. CEO was somewhat concerned, asking if policy was too strict, given company already had security cameras in common areas. I said security cameras were different from individual recordings, that employees recording each other created toxic environment. That policy would protect vulnerable employees from being recorded without consent, which could be used against them. CEO approved policy with caveat that it be applied consistently to everyone regardless of position or circumstance. Rolled out recording ban and mandatory all-hands meeting, explaining that any recording of workplace interactions was now terminable offense. Emphasized that privacy was fundamental right and recording colleagues violated trust necessary for healthy workplace culture. Set up posters throughout facility with clear messaging that recording conversations or meetings was prohibited and would result in termination. First week after policy implementation had to address production supervisor who'd been recording team meetings for personal notes. Male supervisor named Keith had been recording meetings to review later since he had difficulty processing verbal information in real time. Following new policy, placed Keith on administrative leave, pending investigation for violating recording ban. Keith explained he had documented learning disability, making it hard to retain verbal information without ability to review recordings, that he'd been recording meetings for 3 years to accommodate his disability, and had never shared recordings with anyone. I said disability accommodation couldn't override company-wide privacy policy, protecting all employees from surveillance, that he needed to find alternative accommodation like written meeting notes rather than recording colleagues without consent. Keith said written notes didn't work for him because he couldn't write fast enough while processing discussion in real time. Asked if company would provide note-taker as accommodation if recording wasn't allowed under new policy. I said we'd explore accommodations. But recording ban was firm policy that couldn't be violated, even for disability reasons. Terminated Keith's employment for policy violations, citing need to enforce recording ban consistently from day one. He seemed devastated, saying he'd been good supervisor for 8 years, and recording had been essential accommodation, but I felt confident that enforcing policy strictly would establish clear expectations and protect employee privacy company-wide. Second month after policy implementation, received complaint from female production worker about male colleague's behavior. Female worker, named Ashley, reported that male colleague named Brian had made her uncomfortable with comments about her appearance. Started investigation by calling Ashley into my office to discuss her concerns in detail about Brian's alleged comments. Ashley described Brian, saying her new haircut looked nice and asking if she'd done something different with her hair. That she'd felt uncomfortable because comments about appearance from male colleague felt inappropriate and objectifying. I validated her feelings, saying she was right to report and that I'd address Brian's inappropriate workplace conduct. Called Brian into office to discuss Ashley's complaint about his comments regarding her appearance and haircut. Brian seemed confused, saying he'd complimented colleague's haircut same way he'd compliment anyone who'd changed their appearance. I said Ashley had experienced his comments as inappropriate, which meant they were inappropriate regardless of his intent, that workplace comments about women's appearance created hostile environment even if he thought he was being friendly. Brian said he'd complimented male colleagues on haircuts and new clothes without it being considered harassment. I said impact on women was different because of historical objectification. His behavior toward Ashley needed to stop immediately, issued formal, written warning to Brian that would remain in his personnel file, permanently affecting future advancement opportunities. He accepted warnings, seeming frustrated, but resigned to consequences of what I'd characterized as inappropriate conduct. During this interaction with Brian, I'd made several comments about men needing to learn boundaries and stop objectifying women, that men like him created hostile environments for women through microaggressions they didn't even recognize as problematic, and that Ashley was brave for reporting his inappropriate behavior rather than suffering in silence like many women did. Unbeknownst to me, Brian had decided weeks earlier to record workplace interactions for his own protection after Keith's termination. That watching supervisor get fired for recording meetings had made him concerned about potential false accusations without evidence. He'd installed a small audio recording app on his phone that he kept in his pocket during all workplace interactions. My entire conversation with him, including comments about men like him and microaggressions, had been recorded without my knowledge. 3 weeks after Brian's warning, he filed formal discrimination complaint with EEOC, claiming I discriminated based on gender. Complaint stated that I disciplined him for complimenting haircut, which was normal workplace interaction, not harassment. That investigation had been biased from start, with my comments about men needing to learn boundaries showing predetermined conclusion, and that I'd explicitly stated different standards applied to men versus women in identical situation, which was gender discrimination. Most damaging was that Brian had attached audio recording of entire conversation as evidence of discriminatory statements. Recording captured me saying men's comments about appearance were inappropriate, while women's identical comments would be acceptable. That impact on women was different because of gender requiring different standards for male versus female workplace behavior, and my characterizations of Brian as creating hostile environment through microaggressions, despite him treating everyone equally. Felt shocked and betrayed that Brian had violated recording ban policy by secretly recording, called emergency meeting with company attorney to discuss EEOC complaint and illegally obtained recording being used as evidence. Attorney reviewed recording and complaint with serious concern, saying recording clearly showed gender-based differential treatment, that my statements about applying different standards to men versus women constituted explicit admission of discriminatory policy. I said recording had been obtained illegally in violation of company policy, and Brian should be terminated immediately. Attorney said terminating him now would be obvious retaliation for filing EEOC complaint, creating additional liability, and that while recording violated company policy, it was legal under state's one-party consent law for recording conversations, that EEOC would likely consider recording as evidence regardless of company policy prohibiting workplace recordings. As actually told Brian that same behavior from women would be acceptable, while his was inappropriate because of gender. I felt defensive but had to admit recording accurately captured me, stating different standards applied based on gender. Attorney said that was textbook admission of gender discrimination that would be nearly impossible to defend in investigation. For weeks after EEOC complaint filed, company received formal investigation notice requiring production of all relevant documents. EEOC investigator requested all policies, training materials, complaint records, and Brian's personnel file for review. Also requested interview with me to discuss my role in handling Ashley's complaint and subsequent discipline of Brian. Prepared for interview by reviewing company policies on harassment and my handling of Ashley's complaint against Brian. During EEOC interview, investigator asked me to explain how I determined Brian's haircut compliment constituted harassment. I explained that Ashley had felt uncomfortable which meant Brian's behavior had created hostile environment requiring discipline. Investigator asked if I'd investigated whether Brian made similar comments to male colleagues or only to women. I said I hadn't investigated that because Ashley's experience of discomfort was sufficient evidence. His behavior was problematic. Investigator played recording where I'd explicitly stated men's comments about appearance were held to different standard than women's. Asked me to explain how applying different standards based on gender didn't constitute discrimination against male employees. I felt trapped explaining that women faced historical objectification. So identical behavior had different impact when coming from men. Investigators said impact might be different. But disciplining someone for behavior that would be acceptable from different gender was discrimination. Asked if I'd issued any warnings to female employees for complimenting male colleagues' appearance in similar workplace situations. I admitted I hadn't, because I didn't consider women's compliments to create same problematic dynamic as men's comments. Investigators said that was explicit gender-based differential treatment in violation of employment discrimination law. 2 months after EEOC interview, received preliminary determination. Finding reasonable cause to believe I'd engaged in gender discrimination. Determination stated that recording clearly showed me applying different workplace standards to Brian based solely on his gender. That disciplining him for haircut compliment, while stating identical behavior from women would be acceptable, was discriminatory, and that my comments about men like him and microaggressions showed bias affecting my handling of complaint. Recommended company settle with Brian for damages and implement training on non-discriminatory complaint investigation. CEO called emergency meeting with board and attorney to discuss EOC determination and company's liability from my actions. Said preliminary finding of discrimination based on my recorded statements created serious problem for company's legal position. That my explicit admission of applying different standards based on gender made defending case virtually impossible. And that Brian's recording, while violating company policy, had captured clear evidence of discriminatory treatment. Board asked how I'd allowed myself to make explicit statements about gender-based differential treatment during investigation. I explained I'd been applying feminist analysis about impact of behavior from powerful groups versus marginalized groups, that men complimenting women's appearance had different meaning because of patriarchal context of objectification. Attorney said that might be valid social analysis, but it wasn't legal basis for workplace discipline under employment law. That discrimination law prohibited treating people differently based on gender, regardless of historical or social context. CEO said recording ban policy I'd implemented had been intended to protect privacy, but had backfired by making employees feel need to record. That Keith's termination for recording meetings had made Brian feel vulnerable to false accusations without evidence. So he'd recorded interactions for protection and caught me making explicitly discriminatory statements in process. Asked whether I could continue as HR director after creating significant liability through documented gender discrimination. 3 months after EEOC complaint, company settled with Brian for $175. 0 inches damages plus agreement to rescind warning from file. Settlement included my completion of extensive training on non-discriminatory investigation practices and employment law, and revision of recording ban policy to allow recordings for legitimate purposes, including disability, accommodation, and self-P protection. Board placed me on probation, requiring oversight of all complaint, investigations, and discipline decisions for next year. Felt humiliated that my feminist approach to complaints had been characterized as illegal gender discrimination requiring settlement. Posted on feminist HR forums about being investigated for EEOC complaint after disciplining male employee for inappropriate behavior. Got very mixed responses, with some feminists supporting my analysis and others saying I'd clearly violated employment law. One HR director commented, "You can't explicitly state different standards for men versus women. That's textbook discrimination." Another commented, "Recording captured you admitting gender bias in investigation. Settlement was inevitable with that evidence." But some feminists defended approach, saying context mattered and identical behavior from men versus women had different impact. One commenter said, You were right that men's comments about women's appearance are problematic, even if legally you couldn't discipline. Another said, EEOC doesn't understand feminist analysis about power dynamics. This is why women can't advance in corporate HR. Started therapy to process settlement and probation. Trying to understand what had gone wrong with my handling of complaint, therapist asked me to describe how I'd approached Ashley's complaint about Brian's haircut compliment. I said I'd validated her feelings and disciplined Brian for making her uncomfortable with comments about her appearance. She asked if I'd investigated whether Brian made similar comments to everyone or specifically targeted women. I was quiet because I'd never investigated his pattern. Just accepted Ashley's interpretation as sufficient evidence. Therapist said, "It sounds like you'd assumed Brian's comment was harassment based on gender rather than investigating actual behavior. That recording showed you'd explicitly told him identical behavior from women would be acceptable, which was discrimination, and that feminist analysis about patriarchal context didn't override employment law requiring equal treatment regardless of gender. This was painful realization that my feminist framework had led me to violate basic anti-discrimination principles. Started thinking about how I'd handled Brian's case and what recording had actually captured me, saying, had explicitly stated that men's comments about appearance were inappropriate, while women's identical comments were acceptable, had characterized him as creating hostile environment through microaggressions without investigating whether he treated everyone equally, had made assumptions about his intent and impact based on his gender rather than his actual pattern of behavior. Recording had captured me applying exactly the kind of gender-based discrimination employment law prohibited 6 months after settlement, revised my approach to complaint investigation, focusing on behavior patterns rather than identity. When production worker named Michelle complained about male colleague Marcus commenting on her outfit, instead of immediately validating and disciplining, I investigated whether Marcus made similar comments to everyone, found Marcus frequently complimented both male and female colleagues on clothing, accessories, and appearance changes. That his comment to Michelle had been consistent with pattern of friendly observations he made to entire team, explained to Michelle that, while her discomfort was valid, Marcus's behavior didn't constitute harassment given consistent pattern, offered mediation if his friendliness made her uncomfortable, but explained investigation showed no gender-based differential treatment. Michelle appreciated thorough investigation and mediation resolved situation without discipline for normal workplace friendliness. This felt different from Brian's situation where I'd rushed to discipline without investigating whether behavior was actually discriminatory. 9 months after settlement, recording ban policy was revised to allow recording for disability, accommodation, and documentation. Keith, who'd been terminated for recording meetings with his disability accommodation, was offered reinstatement with back pay. He declined, saying he'd found position at company that valued disability accommodations over blanket surveillance policies, but company had to pay settlement for disability discrimination in addition to gender discrimination settlement with Brian. Total cost of my policy decisions and discriminatory investigation was approaching $300, 0 inches settlements, plus legal fees. CEO called review meeting, saying my first year as HR director had created more liability than previous 5 years combined. That recording ban policy had backfired, making employees feel need to record for protection, and that my handling of Brian's complaint had resulted in documented gender discrimination requiring expensive settlement. Asked directly if I understood difference between feminist social analysis and legal requirements for equal treatment, I said I was learning that employment law required focusing on behavior patterns rather than identity-based impact assumptions. That recording of conversation with Brian had been brutal evidence of me applying discriminatory standards I'd thought were progressive. CEO said I could continue as HR director on probation, but any future complaints of discriminatory investigation would result in termination. Year after EOCC settlement reflected on how recording I thought was illegal had actually exposed my discriminatory practices. realized that Brian had recorded our conversation because Keith's termination had made him afraid of false accusations, that my recording ban policy, intended to protect privacy, had instead made employees feel need to document for self-P protection, and that recording had captured me making explicitly discriminatory statements I believed were appropriate feminist analysis, started doing consulting work, helping other HR professionals distinguish between social analysis and legal investigation requirements. Main message was that recording of my conversation with Brian had been gift showing discriminatory bias I hadn't recognized, that I'd violated employment law by explicitly applying different standards to men versus women in workplace discipline. One consulting client had been investigating complaints using similar gender-based framework I'd applied with Brian. My experience helped them understand they were creating discrimination liability by assuming identical behavior had different meaning based on gender. Another client had implemented recording bans similar to mine, revised policy after understanding it had made employees feel vulnerable. 2 years after settlement published article about experience titled "My Recording Ban Backfired When Recording Caught My Discrimination," detailed how I'd implemented policy to protect privacy, but employees had felt need to record for self-P protection, that Brian's recording had captured me explicitly stating different standards applied to men versus women, and that settlement had been inevitable once recording showed clear evidence of gender-based discriminatory treatment. Article went viral in HR community with over 300K reads and intense responses about discrimination and workplace recording. Many HR professionals appreciated honest accounting of how feminist framework had led to illegal discriminatory practices. One HR director commented, "Essential cautionary tale about applying social analysis as if it were legal standard for discipline." Another commented, "Your recording showed textbook discrimination. Important reminder that employment law requires equal treatment." But some feminists criticized articles saying, I'd capitulated to patriarchal legal system rather than standing firm on feminist principles. One blogger wrote, author betrayed feminist analysis by admitting different standards for men was discrimination. Another wrote article gives employers ammunition to dismiss legitimate complaints about men's behavior toward women 3 years after settlement ran into Brian, who'd filed EEOC complaint with recording of our discriminatory conversation. He said settlement had vindicated him, but damage from written warning and investigation had affected his workplace relationships that he'd felt he needed to record after Keith's termination because he was afraid of false accusations without evidence. Recording had proven his instinct right by capturing me applying discriminatory standards he'd feared would be used against him. I apologize for discriminatory investigation and for creating environment where he'd felt need to record for self-P protection. He said he appreciated apology and hoped my work helped other HR professionals avoid making same discriminatory mistakes, that his recording had become famous case study in employment law courses about evidence of explicit gender discrimination 4 years after settlement published book about experience, wanting to help HR professionals understand employment law boundaries. Detailed complete story from recording ban to discriminatory investigation to EEOC complaint to settlement and probation. Included legal analysis of why feminist social analysis about patriarchal context didn't override equal treatment requirements and framework for investigating complaints based on behavior patterns rather than identity-based impact. Assumptions. Book became required reading in HR programs as case study about discrimination through applying different standards by gender. One law professor wrote, essential text for understanding how progressive intentions can create illegal discriminatory outcomes. Another wrote, author's recording of herself discriminating is powerful evidence for teaching employment law principles. Started speaking at HR conferences about experience being caught discriminating on recording. Ben. Main message was that recording ban had backfired by making Brian feel he needed evidence against false accusations. That recording had captured me explicitly applying different standards based on gender, which was textbook discrimination. One conference attendee said she'd been investigating complaints, same way. Presentation helped her see discriminatory pattern. Another said his company had recording ban, creating same vulnerability, revised policy, after understanding employee's perspective, 5 years after settlement published, follow-up research on workplace recording policies and discrimination documentation, studied 200 companies comparing those with recording bans versus those allowing recording for legitimate purposes, found that recording bans increased employee anxiety about false accusations, leading to secret recording for protection. While policies allowing legitimate recording reduced anxiety and actually captured less problematic behavior overall, research showed my recording ban had created exactly the environment where employees felt need to record secretly, started training HR professionals on balanced recording policies and non-discriminatory complaint investigation. Main framework was allowing recording for legitimate purposes while investigating complaints based on patterns, not identity. First, HR professionals implementing training reported better outcomes with both employee trust and lawful investigations. 6 years after settlement received message from employment attorney, who'd used my case in discrimination law courses, said recording of me telling Brian different standards applied to men was clearest evidence of intentional discrimination he'd seen. That case was used to teach law students about explicit admission of discriminatory intent in employment decisions, and that my honesty about mistakes in article and book had made case even more valuable for teaching purposes. I thanked him for message, saying, if my discriminatory mistake could teach future professionals, it gave meaning to failure. Current reflection. 7 years after banning cameras, then getting caught discriminating on camera I didn't know existed, learned that recording ban had backfired, making Brian feel need to document our conversation for his protection. That recording had captured me explicitly applying different workplace standards based on gender, which was illegal discrimination. That feminist analysis about patriarchal context didn't override employment law requirement for equal treatment regardless of gender. That settlement and probation had been appropriate consequences for documented gender discrimination and complaint investigation. Most importantly, that recording I tried to prevent had been gift-exposing discriminatory practices I believed were progressive. That's what I learned from banning workplace recording than being caught discriminating on secretly recorded conversation. From believing different standards for men was feminist to understanding it was illegal, gender discrimination. From recording ban creating privacy to recognizing it created vulnerability, employees protected themselves against. That's my complete story about recording policy backfiring when recording caught my discriminatory investigation practices. 7 years after caught discriminating, continued consulting, helping HR professionals avoid applying identity-based standards. Most impactful work involved HR directors recognizing themselves, investigating complaints with gender-based assumptions. One HR manager had been disciplining men for behavior she'd accept from women. Similar to my approach with Brian, after hearing complete story about recording capturing discrimination, she revised investigation approach to focus on patterns, investigated subsequent complaint by examining whether behavior was consistent across genders, finding no differential treatment, resolved situation without discriminatory discipline that would have created liability like my handling of Brian's case. Another HR director had recording ban creating employee anxiety about false accusations like my policy had created, worked with them on revising policy to allow legitimate recording, reducing anxiety while maintaining appropriate privacy boundaries. 8 years after settlement published second book about sustainable complaint investigation without discriminatory assumptions, detailed framework for examining behavior patterns across demographics rather than assuming identity. Determined impact included research showing pattern-based investigation led to better outcomes than identity-based impact assumptions and case studies, comparing lawful investigations to discriminatory ones like my handling of Brian's haircut compliment. Book became standard text for HR professionals learning to investigate complaints without creating discrimination liability. 9 years after settlement reflected on nearly decades since recording, had exposed my discriminatory investigation practices, realized that Brian had been right to record after Keith's termination had shown recording ban could leave him vulnerable. That recording had captured exactly the discriminatory treatment he'd feared, showing different standards applied based on gender, and that my recording ban policy had created an environment where employees felt need to document interactions for protection, started mentoring young HR professionals, specifically about equal treatment requirements, regardless of social analysis. One mentee wanted to discipline man for compliment while accepting identical behavior from women like I'd done with Brian. After our work together, she understood that was gender discrimination, regardless of feminist analysis about patriarchal context. Investigated by examining whether employee made similar comments to everyone, finding pattern of friendly workplace interaction. Another mentee had implemented recording ban, creating employee concerns about documentation similar to my policy, helped her understand allowing legitimate recording actually increased trust while my ban had created anxiety and secret recording. 10 years after settlement reflected on complete decade since recording captured me discriminating against Brian. Realized that single conversation, where I'd applied different standards based on gender, had cost company $175. Ling ling ling. That recording ban trying to protect privacy had backfired, making Brian feel he needed evidence against potential false accusations, and that recording exposing my discrimination had been more valuable lesson than any training about equal treatment. Current reflection. 11 years after banning recording, then being caught discriminating on secretly recorded conversation, learned that recording ban had created exactly vulnerability employees protected themselves against through secret recording. That Brian's recording had captured textbook evidence of gender discrimination through applying different standards, that feminist social analysis about impact didn't override employment law requiring equal treatment regardless of gender. That settlement, probation, and policy revision had been appropriate consequences for documented discriminatory investigation. Most importantly, that recording I tried to ban had exposed discriminatory practices, preventing me from causing more harm. That's everything learned from 11 years since recording ban backfired when recording caught my discrimination. From implementing policy to protect privacy, to understanding it created need for protective documentation. From applying different standards by gender, to investigating behavior patterns across all demographics equally. That's my final lesson about banning recording than being caught on recording discriminating exactly as feared.